open, look more, no hands, look bald, no frame, no shame. Numb me up like cocaine, can't focus, shaky can. Which moment makes a man? Cause I'm hoping it just begins.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Robert Groves, your host for the Groves Connection podcast. The Groves Connection brings you intimate conversations with pundits, providers, patients, leaders, and lay people, all to help us understand a contradiction. How can our healthcare system be both magnificent and yet so deeply flawed? We're going inside healthcare to talk candidly with those who know. What they have to say may delight, surprise, frustrate, or at times even anger you. But I invite you to get curious and listen to the truth about healthcare and those who want to fix it. Maybe the answers have been there all along. We just need to make the connection. Are you ready to connect? Dr. Keith Shah, welcome to the Groves Connection.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this for some time, and we've had a couple of starts and stops, and by golly, it's actually going to happen now. So I'm excited about that.
I as am I. So
all right. So Keith, as you know, usually what I do with these is I'll start way back because I like to know how people came to be in the positions they're in. First time on the show, you've not shared your story with my listeners before. So, and I like to start way back in grade school. So I'm curious as to what kind of kid you were, where you grew up, what was it like back then?
You going deep. So I am the youngest of three. I share that only in the fact that I have two older brothers. So I apologize in advance for everything that I've grown into, and I'm going to place a significant blame on them. But no, so youngest of three, two older brothers that continue to be good mentors, good go first people to observe in life. I think all of us were fairly pushed in terms of our parents were great forces for us in terms of just guidance and mentorship and but they had pretty high standards they wanted us to live up to, so we tried our best. I had a good visual of what could be by watching them. So give me a little bit more. So when you were, let's say, in grade school, did you have any inkling that you'd wind up doing what you do today? What was your goal? I mean, I remember at one point I wanted to be a forest ranger. Obviously, it didn't work out for me, but that was one of my goals when I was very young. I don't know if I didn't have the forest ranger goal. I had probably a lot of goals. I would tell you, I probably ended up certainly at the intersection of my two parents that I mentioned already. One was a midwife in Ireland.
Wow.
And came to this country to study nursing because she couldn't be a midwife when she came. And then my father is an engineer, and when he has sons, he was 100% committed on making everyone an engineer around him. So I live at kind of the intersection of those two. I love problem solving. I love analytical challenges. And yet I'm passionate and committed to healthcare. And so I can only draw the conclusion of, in no small part because of their passions and their disposition and the household I grew up in. So
I'm curious about what your siblings ended up doing. Where did they?
None of us are engineers. So my eldest brother is a social psychologist, which I'm sure my father even recognized as a line of study up until maybe recently. My other brother was actually trained as an engineer, became very committed to his faith, and has served as a pastor for a number of years.
Is that right? Wow. Okay. Interesting backstory. So now we're going to move into high school. Were you a sports guy? Were you a debate club guy? Tell me about your high school experience.
Gosh, I was probably an aspiring sports guy, but not hugely talented. And the schools I went to, I think had an athletic focus, and I was at best probably middle of the pack.
Yep.
Enjoyed
Can
sport.
relate to that, by the way.
Yeah, I enjoyed team sports, more for the camaraderie and the kind of sink or swim together mindset.
Yep.
We played in our family. We played tennis. We played basketball. My eldest brother has this great story about trying to play at playing football, and he played at a large. Well, he practiced, I should say. He went out for the team at Central Catholic. This is in Pittsburgh, which is a big football school.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And has a great story about made it, I think, maybe past the first cut, and then after that realized the football dream is dying. And so my other brother and I lived vicariously through him, and never even really tried. So
yeah. And what kind of student were you?
Good student. High school, I moved around a fair amount. And so because of that, I had probably more disruption to my coursework than I would have liked. And probably was pretty successful at using that as an excuse to not be as good a student as I wanted to be.
Yeah.
But prior to that, always very focused on education. Came from an environment that was very focused on education, and so always took it seriously. But we did move. My father's role, he was actually in academia, and so provided me an education to see a good chunk of the country, but not necessarily stability in coursework when you're every other year sort of thing.
Yeah, got it. So, I'm always interested when I talk to folks who have accomplished a great deal in their careers. You have, as to how you're coming to the end of your high school career. You're a senior now. What do you do in looking at colleges? Did you go to a legacy school? Did you look everywhere? Did you have one spot in mind? How did that work for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I applied to all larger, either state schools or private schools.
Okay.
A little of that was by design. I knew, as I mentioned, there was no question I was going to be an engineer, at least starting. And I knew if I went to a larger school as well, I'd have some flexibility in terms of coursework. And my parents at the time kind of encouraged that with all of their children. Go to maybe a larger school, find yourself sort of thing, explore other opportunities as well. And so did that. Did move a fair amount in high school. So I wanted to stay at the time. I graduated a school in Philadelphia. So I wanted to stay a little bit closer. I did apply to universities that were maybe in every time zone, I think. Had pros and cons for each, but landed on a school that was not too far from where I had finished high school. So I wanted to stick around the Philadelphia area at that point.
Gotcha. And what was your major?
I started as an engineer. And so I finished in industrial engineering. And to this day, my father refers to it as imaginary engineering, and still gives me grief about in terms of. But industrial, as you know, is a lot of process, a lot of systems. Has a fair amount of business courses as well.
Yep.
So enjoyed those as well. So the crossover between the School of Engineering and the School of Business was significant.
I was going to say that sounds like a good preparation for your future career, whether you knew it or not at the time.
Yeah, it's a great question. Wasn't at that stage necessarily focused on healthcare. It was a co-op school, so I had some co-op opportunities, a little bit more life sciences than healthcare oriented, and that was great because it's, as you know, we have plenty of processes to clean up and plenty of systems to look at. And so that was kind of the first foray into that, but had not made that connection yet to a little bit more of the mission orientation that I've benefited from for the last few decades. Not at that stage.
Gotcha. So we got you now with an engineering degree. And when did you decide that you wanted to further your education, and how did you make that decision, and where'd you wind up?
So I mentioned the school I went to, Drexel University, as an undergrad. It's not the least expensive school, but they do have phenomenal experiential learning opportunities, so co-ops.
Okay.
And I pulled that thread a little bit through. I ended up taking a job at Greenville, at the time, Greenville Hospital System, before they became a health system.
Yeah.
And they were super supportive as well. I wanted to focus and continue my education. Took some courses as a non-matriculating grad student
Yeah.
on industrial psychology. Enjoyed so marrying the process orientation that I had with a little bit more of the people side. Started to already
Right.
at that point in my career understand, hey, you can have a great process, but if you don't have a laser focus towards the people and the talent as well, how far are you really going to get? That was great. That translated into, ended up with a master's degree in really kind of org behavior and design. Didn't even,
So were you working full time while
I
you
was.
acquired that degree? Yeah. Yeah.
I was. And in fact, you'll see that throughout my entire, even including my doctoral work,
Is
was
that
work.
right?
Yeah. And just enjoyed it because it was a way to, learn and get deeper on certain subjects and yet also make progress in my career, while not incurring a lot of debt, quite honestly. Just
Yeah.
the pragmatism of how expensive, and this is decades ago now, how expensive higher education can be, but yet the value that I was getting from it. So enjoyed it.
Yeah. Did you find that it was difficult for you to work full time and do well in your coursework? Is that a
Yeah.
challenge?
This was all before marriage and kids, and
Yeah.
I had a ton of support in just both my career, this career settings I had. I always had management and other corporate support that was just beyond just um, the talk, setting the stage for me to allow me to be super successful and committed and driven at work, but also a little bit of flexibility. And then also, even with the academic side, I had advisors and mentors that were great, understanding, and also very supportive of understanding, hey, I was working full time and wanted to have kind of the best of both worlds. But yeah, a lot of evenings, almost every weekend was consumed, sort of thing.
Gotcha. Yeah. So now, if you would take us through those parts of your career that, from first job through, I guess, where you felt like you started hitting your stride, like this is what I want to do. How did that evolve for you?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm there yet. So
I
I will
love it.
tell you a couple of the pivots.
Okay.
So mentioned working in a health system setting, enjoyed that for all the mission orientation kind of things that we discuss in healthcare across the board. And then what I found was I'd finished a couple master's degrees at that point. And so I'd finished the first master's.
One's not enough for you, is that
Well,
right?
at that point I was just like, well, let's just keep going.
Yeah, yeah.
Finished a business degree, and then at that point started to look around. I had looked at actually consulting. I had a couple offers from some of the larger firms like Accenture and Deloitte,
Gotcha.
and was all set. I had friends. I had a girlfriend at the time that was in consulting. I had a cousin in Europe who was a senior partner at one of these firms. And actually he gave me some great advice around, he knew I had an interest in healthcare. And as he mentioned, I'd be going in at a mid-level. And so just to be eyes wide open around, you may find yourself, while you're interested in healthcare, getting pulled into another industry. So just be mindful of that.
Mhm.
And then at that point, I had another opportunity that was being enticing. It was becoming enticing to me in Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. So this was a
Gotcha.
payer, a single state, very well run health plan, had come calling to say, here's an opportunity we have. We have this analytical group. We're trying to kind of grow it. And I liked that. I liked it from the standpoint of I had not been on the payer side at all.
Mhm.
I felt like, well, this would be interesting. It'd still be healthcare related, but it would be a different side of the
Yeah.
coin. My concern was at the time, and I was probably way over dramatic in my 20s, thinking, hey, if I go this route, I'll now be locked into healthcare, right? And that's it, sort of thing.
Mhm.
Well, how zero fungibility, I won't be able to change.
Yeah.
And around this time, this was around 2000.
Okay.
At that point, one of the things that I tell folks all the time that was the most meaningful was looking at the future wave of demography and the shift of demographics that was going to occur in the next, call it 30, 40 years, which I viewed at that point as my usable lifetime. And I felt at this point, hey, look, what that shift will tell you was, even if we did things perfectly in the healthcare system, and that's a big if, the shift of volume, the folks that are going to be aging into the typical patient, member, whatever orientation you are coming from, provider or payer or otherwise, was going to only grow, and it was going to grow significantly. And so therefore, there's going to be a ton of problems to solve. There's going to be a ton of opportunities for growth. And if you had to pick one industry, what better industry to pick? And it was also at that point as well, the intersection of, healthcare is in many ways like a lot of other industries. It has some of the same challenges. It has some of the same supply chain issues and talent, labor and workforce and all the technology issues. And in other ways, it's an industry that's wholly unique in the fact that it has a morality and a humanity to it like no other. And so that intersection, all those questions coming to bear really then allowed me to jump into the Blue Cross opportunity. But being where I was still, I had also been having conversations with the folks at the University of South Carolina to pursue a PhD in public health. And knew I could do those things potentially if I took that role, because I wouldn't have as much travel burden as some of these other roles I was looking at. And focus. And so I did that. I accepted the job. I started, I think, in April of that year. And by August, I was already into my coursework for my doctoral studies. And you know,
that's taken on a lot. I mean, the first time in the payer world, and you're working on public health degree at the PhD at the same time. I'm sure you were quite busy during those years. In terms of a couple of questions that I have, and I'll ask them one at a time. In terms of how you're thinking at the time, you mentioned how you had this fear that you were going to be locked in, you never do anything outside of healthcare, but then you also mentioned that healthcare has a heart, for lack of for shorthand, that there's a mission that resonates with most people wanting to help others, particularly in their time of need. But did you think at that point that you were solid in healthcare then? I mean, you made the decision, you're going to stick with it, or were you still thinking, I'm flexible, I can do? You're getting a PhD in public health, and so I'm kind of guessing here, but
I didn't view. Now I was all in at that point. I knew within. Now I say all in within the industry, but as you know, our industry is expansive to begin with, right? I mean, there's all aspects on the clinical side, the provider side. Even within the provider, you look at different orientations and care coordination and different aspects. And of course, what we've seen in terms of the evolution of maturity of different models, and then you layer on a whole financial engine on the payer side, all of which has only continued the last 2 decades to really compound and get increasingly complex for a lot of challenges, and yet for also a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of strength in terms of what the U.S. has done. There's a lot of vulnerability and weakness, and obviously the divisiveness in terms of certain trends. And so it's been in that regard, felt like there's a ton here. And of course, like everything, since that time, I felt like, hey, I've absorbed a lot, learned a lot. And every time I feel like I learned something, there's a 2x multiplier, what else there is to now go identify and figure out.
There are steep learning curves around every corner, it seems like,
that.
in healthcare.
Well
There's
said,
no doubt. Yeah. So tell me about your progress so far. You're getting an advanced degree. You're working on the payer side. Are there any mentors? I mean, we all have mentors, I'm sure, but are there any that stand out as, this person made a difference in the trajectory of my career, my happiness, whatever?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I've benefited from tremendously. So I'll start on the academic side. I had a phenomenal department chair who was also my doctoral chair and research chair, who was super supportive, understood exactly that I was a little bit unique. I was not a public health purist.
Yep.
and yet was super supportive of what, in fact, I was trying to do, and also the background in which I had, coming from a health system, then currently working in a payer. These can be, in some situations, diametrically opposed
Oh yeah.
to
Oh yeah.
and I was studying public health really in the era when population health and value-based care were barely on the radar,
Right.
just starting to emerge.
Right.
And so the timing was interestingly good from the standpoint of as a student and as a future leader for some of these programs, but yet still being very much developed. So that's the academic side. Had tremendous mentorship there from very hard-charging researchers that really knew
Yeah.
the fundamentals from a public health standpoint. And then on the professional side, I also benefited from very senior leaders that I would have not normally have been on their radar at all, who had heard about, hey, there's this young manager in this area and he's getting his doctorate. And my senior leadership at that Blue was just couldn't have been more supportive. I think at first they were intrigued
Yeah. Yeah.
they themselves were starting. This was all before the Accountable Care Act and some of the thinking now that we take for granted a little bit in our industry.
Yeah. Yeah.
But really progressive leadership as an organization. And so there was a handful. Our CEO, starting at the top, was just tremendous. And, I was in a role that, quite honestly, that the fact that the CEO knew my name was
That was remarkable.
neat,
Yeah.
at that point in my career. And
Yeah.
he was a brilliant guy, and he had a brilliant staff and some other senior leaders that just were tremendous.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you said earlier, and you do have a very unique set of perspectives. You worked on the delivery side, you worked on the payer side, and you're studying public health, which is all three very, very different angles on the same process. And
Yeah.
I'm sure there's lots of learning there, and steep learning curves all around.
It really was. And, I couldn't have been more purposeful in trying to get that exposure, and then just benefited from some of those simple decisions of like, let me force myself here. I
Yeah.
say this all the time, a little bit tongue in cheek. So,
Yeah.
but when I was at the Blues are the ones that, there's 34 currently different Blues, 33 maybe, depending on some consolidation. And they will continue to evolve. For the most part, super well run. Very community oriented in terms of how they show up. The plan I was at it just exemplified that. Really great people showing up every day for their community. And at the same point, very good at creating sustainable business models and creating, working with the business community on economic development for the region and how health
Yes.
intersects with that. Fundamental. What they don't always have sometimes is an interest in some of what I view are some of the more interesting upstream conversations in healthcare. And so couple that with spending the evenings and the weekends and whatever free time I had with all my public health professionals, those folks ask some of the most interesting questions, I think, in all of healthcare. They go so far upstream before even population health and value-based care starts to kick in. They really have. The challenge with my colleagues in that space sometimes is there's not as much lens towards the sustainability. And so
Right.
they're always looking to say, all right, well, how can we figure out where some of these funds are going to come from? Taking the two of those worlds and sitting both as an active participant, but then also on the sidelines and watching other true experts in each was just awesome. It was a great experience. It was a great time. It continues to be where I benefit from when I jump back into public health conversations with my absolute purist zealot friends and colleagues. I learn more, and then I try to take back and then say, how can I create some sustainability in some of the other environments I sit in?
Yeah,
So-
we're going to talk about some of that in just a minute, but I have another question on career, and then we'll sort of get into the next topic. But why did you leave that job, and where did you wind up after that? Give us a sequence over the next decade, I guess.
Yeah. So I was at Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina for 15 years.
Wow.
and
Okay. So you stuck there a long time.
I stuck there a long time. So finished, I think I had forecasted getting my doctorate in 5 years. It ended up taking 6. I was actually going after two
Hey,
PhDs.
when you're
Ended up
working full time, man, that's that's
I only ended up getting one.
yeah. Only yeah.
So,
We're so sorry for you.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, but I my forecasting was off a little bit in terms of thoroughly enjoyed it, but then I stuck around. I benefited from really just job enlargement at some level in terms of just the opportunity to work on different things and kind of larger projects and work and working with bigger teams and structure and all that. So that was great. The only reason I quite honestly left that role was after the Accountable Care Act. So the ACA was March 2010, I think was after that. If you remember call it the 3-year run up to the ACA, you had every constituent in healthcare, I think, in some ways feeling a little concerned about what the future would hold.
Sure.
The health plans were no different.
Right.
I think they had major heartburn around certain aspects. And, of course, like all policy, it iterated and ebbed and flowed over time. But after the ACA, I personally felt like all the fun, transformative stuff in healthcare was occurring a little bit more in the middle. Was a little bit, you had providers and health systems across the board looking at the plan saying, hey, there's a bunch of value and goodness that they know that we just don't know. What does that look like? And starting to experiment. Likewise, you had that with health plans. You had some folks saying, hey, we want to go vertical. We want to, and I say this as a UHG alum. March 2010, the ACA was enacted. November of 2011, Optum was officially founded.
Gotcha.
Now, UHG is just an example. There's many payers that were exploring similar, but they had been, building assets for quite some time, much prior to the creation of Optum. But a lot of the things that you see now that you take for granted when you look at, I saw today, I was reading a little bit about Kaiser's acquisition of Geisinger.
Right.
And some of the vertical integration that they're looking to expand on, right? And Kaiser is, of course, that classic model from more really the West Coast. But that was interesting to me. All of that was fascinating. There was that transformative of, and I just happened to work in a health plan that was a little bit more traditional. But as I mentioned, very well run, was doing some inroads into the provider depths, but not like some of these other. And I wanted to kind of see what else was out there. I had been in that role in that plan for quite some time, and so I started entertaining. For a long time, actually, for a few years, I would say I was entertaining at least to see what would possibilities look like. And then I ended up taking a role in DC that I kind of felt would do many things, but would give me a provider and payer focused when I moved into it.
So talk to us about that role and how you found that.
Yeah. So I moved to FTI Consulting, which is a DC-based multinational, about a $3 billion consultancy. Their healthcare focus was a little bit more federated throughout the firm. So there wasn't a big healthcare vertical like some of these firms have.
Right.
But they had some very seasoned, very sharp individuals that sat throughout the firm doing specific things within the healthcare arena. I joined the healthcare economics practice and was really able to work with economists on a whole range of work that really transcended provider, payer, a little bit of life sciences as well. And that was a key focus for me. That, to me, felt like a logical next step towards some of the opportunity to work in more transformative work because we would have clients and partners that were really across those three legs of the stool.
Yeah. Well, Keith, when you and I met, you were with FTI Consulting, as I recall, and so
that is
some years ago. How long were you in that role?
Not too long. So I joined as a managing director. After a little over a year, was promoted into a senior managing director role, which is great. It was great to move in and have that opportunity, and wasn't sure even when I took the job. I was like, I don't know if I can be a managing director of A Street consultancy. Was successful, and it's like anything else. They're one of the things I appreciate about my colleagues there is they are aggressive and assertive about how they want to enact value and work with their clients and do great stuff. And so that's its own lifestyle, right? So you celebrate your recognition for half a day, and then they start talking about here are the future goals and opportunities. So love every aspect of that. The only reason I left that is because I was kind of recruited to come join a large academic integrated healthcare system and to almost come full circle in terms of your own career of kind of the environments. And so
return where you started, but it's all different now. Not only is the context different, you're different. I mean, everything has changed, and yet it is a full circle. And in that journey, and we can talk more about where you are now and what you're doing, as much as you please. But I'm following this along. It looks like you have taken, and I'm finding this a lot when I talk to people about how they wound up where they are. There's a traditional journey to places, but a lot of the folks who are very accomplished have had that opportunity to see whatever it is that they're doing from a variety of perspectives. And I think there's some real value there that shouldn't be taken for granted. Is that your experience as well, or how do you see that?
Yeah, well, I guess it would start with how you define traditional. If you think of it in terms of every step has been logical and progressively just ascending upwards, no, that hasn't been. I've been intentional in terms of my desire to really understand things has probably led to some decisions or interests that have moved me both left and right and up and down. And so I've enjoyed that. I enjoy taking things apart, looking at them, but having the prerequisite knowledge to do that and getting the exposure, that's been intentional. And so I would say it was traditional for me in the sense of up until that point where I mentioned joining Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina and starting my doctoral work, because that was, hey, a full recognition of I'm already in healthcare. This is another side of healthcare that would be very powerful if I understood it. Whether I liked it or not had nothing to do with as much as it would help me in solutioning, which was always been the end goal. And then also layer on, let's go super deep with public health. Let's go super deep studying health economics in a meaningful way that then I benefited from. That was in that wave of population health and value-based care and policy happening in the administration that was getting us to have much more serious conversations. So I just benefited from all that. That would certainly not be traditional in that sense. Now the dividends that I find in every role, or really every opportunity that I sometimes get pulled into in terms of solutioning and problem solving, I can think back to steps or roles that I've had in previous years that have really helped me now in creating solutions going forward. And I'm, benefited from that, but I continue whatever I got left in the tank in terms of time in the industry. I know I'll continue to leverage that stuff.
So Keith, what to date, what contributions are you most proud of? What do you look back and say, yeah, I did that, and I'm proud of that? Now, obviously, we all have help, we all have fortune, good or bad, but it takes effort to accomplish things. And so, what things do you think about when you look back on your career so far?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing that jumps to me is just the folks that I've had an opportunity to work with. And I say that in the sense of, and it probably coincides with, so process-oriented guy, we talked about this. We talked about my interest in terms of psychology and then sociology. Somewhere very early in my career, I realized, okay, while I'm a process zealot, and understand as well, hey, you get good process, you'll have good outcomes, and kind of that mindset. I also realized as well, all of that is still predicated on fundamentals of the people that are driving this. And understanding as well, if I was going to do anything of significance, which I've always wanted to work on things of significance, I was not going to be doing it alone.
Yes.
And so it came to whether I was part of another individual's team, whether I was the leader and trying to curate a team, it was going to be a team game. And I think about the things that I'm most proud of. I can literally put a face to the outcomes or the problem that we were trying to solve because of the individuals that either did much more of the heavy lifting and I was just part of the group that we've got to call them a team member, or we were doing it side by side. It still comes down to that face and that. So talent, I think, is the first question. Just enjoyed the people that I've met, even the ones that probably didn't get me or I didn't get them. I've enjoyed the variety of folks that I've had exposure to and benefited from throughout the years. That's me where I start that question.
That's a fantastic answer, Keith. And it reminds me of some things that I think have been instrumental for my career. And one of them you said earlier, and I forgot to mention, is curiosity. Just that drive to understand what the heck is going on and how it works. It sounds like you've got that in spades. And all of the projects that you've talked about, it was some level of curiosity that drove you to find out more, understanding how does this work? How does that work? The other thing is, we are social creatures. There's no question about it. And relationships make the world go round. I mean, that really is fundamental. And I too have been very fortunate to be exposed to a whole lot of talent all around me, frankly, in my personal journey. So those are 2 points worth reinforcing. I think I want to shift gears now a little bit and talk about healthcare today.
Good.
And what you see as the major impediments to quadruple aim. How do you think about it? I know that's a massive question. Feel free to ramble, but I'd like to know how you think about it.
It's a great question. I would say there's an intersection here between, we tend to want to think of solutions in a little bit of very compartmentalized boxes or vacuums. When I think about healthcare and I think about some of the challenges, it depends on how far upstream you want to go.
Right.
And in some ways, I find myself, the majority of my day is spent in conversations and we're talking about care. Yeah. So looking at that word of healthcare, really, it's ripping them apart for a moment and saying, where do we spend our time in a lot of these more traditional roles? We're trying to figure out solutions in the optimization of care. Part of me, the public health professional in me, the colleagues that I adore that work in that space would say, yeah, that's the least efficient place to be spending your time. Go upstream. Go talk about health. Yeah. Go figure out, if you got $1, where are you going to spend that dollar? It's not on the care side. It's on the health side, and really getting passionate. And that's what I've loved about our industry at some level, the conversation, which I feel like has, in some things, there's always measured, it's almost dog years, right, in healthcare. It feels painfully long. But at the same point, we're changing really the perception over time. And we have had come a considerable way since the 90s or the early, in terms of our understanding that we're going to have a real conversation about population health. Then we're talking about health. We're talking about public health. We're talking about diet and nutrition. We're talking about all of these programs that you should really commit towards so that you're mitigating the expensive care solutions that we absolutely have to optimize. There's always going to be a need for care solutions across the board, but it's a little bit of how are you bifurcating and thinking about things before you even jump into them.
I get that. What's the story about the guy that is, busy saving people from drowning? In fact, he's so busy saving people from drowning, he doesn't have enough time to go upstream and find out why they're falling in the first place.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
And that's our system. It's rescue medicine, right? And Brent James and many others have suggested that this whole $4+ trillion system that we call healthcare is focused on rescue medicine and only accounts for about 15% of health span lifespan.
Yeah.
you back up and you say, well, what is health? Then you get into all of those population-based strategies. We came a long way with clean water, clean food, disposal of waste. I mean, those were all projects that have done more to lengthen life than probably anything else. So it's really due to public health that we have the kind of world that we live in today, where we can expect to live past childhood on a regular basis. My question is, do you think that we have misaligned our focus? Because there are some who suggest that we're middle of the pack if you combine social spending and healthcare spending, defined as rescue medicine. In the developed world, we're kind of middle of the pack. We just spend all of it on rescue and not much of it on the social side. Now, I'm a capitalist, but I also see the necessity of doing certain things to prevent an excessive concentration of wealth and an excessive loss of the middle class. And how do we fix all of that stuff? Because we're not going to get, if all we're doing is trying to save people from drowning and the volume keeps increasing, it's a never-ending treadmill. How do we, or do you believe that? Do you think we need to back up and do some of those things?
Well, a couple things. I first of all, I would say, I think it's embedded a little bit in your comments. I think some things that we historically think can't coexist can coexist. And what I mean by that is, I think we can have something that is sustainable from an Adam Smith perspective, right? Yeah. Just a purely as a capitalist, you can create sustainable working business models that also are very much committed to the efficient use of very finite resources, because everything in healthcare, like everything else, is very finite. So I'd push back a little bit on the identity of like, well, you got to pick a lane and you're either in one. I don't think that's true. The other piece though that I think that's implicit to your question is, when we think about these, where we are as a society, as a bigger society, we should be very critical of ourselves. We should be very critical of our community as a group. As individuals, though, I think we as professionals, whether you're a public health professional or whether you're downstream on the care side and you're running a small practice, or you're part of the payer ecosystem and you're trying to figure out what to do best for your members, I think we should also give ourselves a little bit of grace and latitude to understand as well, my day job in some of those other environments that are further down and are about creating efficiencies and stability within a care solutions. I can't be solving for public health issues.
True. Yeah.
Quadruple aim is important, but I can only do as much as my scope job will allow me to do, and then extend empathy and solutioning to my other colleagues that are doing other parts of that and work with them in some capacity. I feel like sometimes we find ourselves in these where we have to go and figure out how we're moving upstream. It's like, well, that's not the business model. That's whether you're running a not-for-profit community safety net hospital, or you're running a for-profit ambulatory center, or you're running a for-profit payer. You still have a very important role, and there's a ton of opportunity to maximize and create solutions without being overly critical of yourself or your colleagues to say, well, why can't we solve these public health issues? Because they're big societal issues.
Yes, they are.
Societal issues that are going to transcend the organization that is supporting you and your family for showing up, still trying to do very good work. They're just differences. So I think that's the first framing, is just to say, what environment am I in and where am I really trying to solve problems? Am I upstream? Am I doing things at a policy perspective that are really going to change how we look at diet and nutrition, or change the quality of the water that we drink in a universal sense? Those are powerfully important jobs done by very skilled people, but they don't necessarily get swayed by individuals that are leaders of organizations that are focused on the individual. They have a very different mission. So giving some grace, I think, is a really big piece, but understanding the difference as well before you jump in and say, we're going to make these big, bold goals.
I want to pause there, because I think that's a really important distinction you made. The perspective of most caregivers is the individual, the patient in front of me right now. And that's a very different perspective with its own set of problems, very different than stepping back and say, as a population, what can we do? They're different jobs and they require different skill sets. And so that's a very important distinction. I like that division. What's your next chapter? What would you like to do next in your career?
Equally great question. I will tell you where I get jet fuel from. I love figuring out on the solutioning side how we can move sets of peoples forward in terms of, that could be a community, that could be, so when we get into true population health, what is that segment and how are we really moving the needle from a success standpoint? For me, the opportunities are now usually transcend both my payer background and the provider experience and context that I've been afforded. And so I'm in a really neat spot where I try to work with colleagues and experts from very deep verticals to then corral and bring them together in a meaningful way to do that. But back to the previous discussion, a lot of that's spent in making sure that we're not over-scoping and we're trying to overreach what we're in fact doing. It's that we can make great progress on certain things that are grounded for the community, but we have to have some specifics. And they're not going to be holistic and they're not going to solve everything.
Right.
You mentioned healthcare and the challenges we have. One of the challenges we have, you can both pull in all our colleagues on the education side. How we fundamentally show up and educate our clinicians, the support that we afford them, the cost that we burden with them with, the idiosyncrasies of you can't have a real conversation in healthcare without then saying, well, let's go upstream. Let's start talking about education and what are the things that we afford. Because when we want to, I mean, we're Americans and we love data and we love metrics. We want to compare. How are we doing compared to other countries? These are apples to bananas type comparisons.
Yes, they are. That's exactly right.
And so that's where it's, how far are you going to go with that? Before, yes, we should be always pushing forward as a group of professionals together. We should always be very strict with ourselves. As individuals trying to show up and do quality work, we have to show each other a little grace. And that's where I think that scope comes in. And that's where I get excited. That's where I've gotten, knock on wood and God's grace, 15, 20 years of super high energy left. That's where I have the most fun with, is pulling those conversations together and working with professionals that are usually multidisciplined in that approach.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got a bunch of energy left. I want to ask you some topical questions now because I just want to make sure we cover them. AI, hype, hope, somewhere in between. Is it going to transform the industry? How do you see that playing out?
I think there's a lot of opportunity. I would say this though. I go back to, I'm a process person. Yep. And so I had the opportunity of working under a CIO for a good chunk of my early career, where he would refer to me as I was the non-technology guy, right? Shah, and I come from a school of thought of if you don't fundamentally understand your processes, adding any level of tech is only going to exacerbate the challenges that have been underneath and percolating for quite some time in a bigger set.
Best example, EMR.
Yes.
That was,
that's exactly right. That's I mean, countless examples of what we've seen. And this is living laboratory stuff we've been living for the last 15 years. In terms of what we're seeing with adoption, consolidation, lack of competition, now, exacerbation of then data and analytics, which still people are still struggling with. And yet at its core, still some of the questions that you unpack and you're thinking, well, this is just bad process.
Yeah.
So what has tech done to, so I think it's, the answer is not, vacillating to the binary framing that you had. I think there's a ton of exciting opportunity. The only forewarning to me would be make sure you really have comfort with your process before you start overcommitting from a cost standpoint and layering on new tech. Because if you can't look at it and explain it, then that's a bigger potential issue before you start then the capital that it's going to take to really kind of be competitive in some of those spaces. And yet the yield it's scary how much it can change and for the better. So some of these opportunities. So it's,
what, I love that answer, Keith. Process is so important. I remember being taught early on, before you automate something, put it down on paper, work through the process, get that exactly right, because otherwise all you're going to do is obscure those points where you have an error or you have an inefficient process or you haven't optimized. You obscure those when you add technology before you complete the process. I think that's an excellent message, especially in these days of AI, and that's a good place for us to conclude for this visit. Is there is there a website or anything you'd like to direct people to get in touch with you if they have more questions or want to get in contact with you, use your services?
Oh, look, I'm available. My I think LinkedIn is probably everybody's go-to in terms of connectivity. Certainly, the one challenge of being very focused in one particular industry is that I have no real fungibility in anything else. I can't jump over to can't tell you about anything on telecommunications or petrochemical or anything in between. But I've also found that healthcare is such a wonderful space in the fact that it's a big, daunting piece of our economy. It's 4.3 trillion in spend, only going continuing to escalate upwards. And yet at the same point, it's a small ecosystem. It's some of the same core practitioners and solution providers and trying to work through some really challenging stuff. So I'm certainly available and enjoy, as I mentioned in one of your questions, I've just enjoyed the people I've had an opportunity to work with. And that's part of the experience of working with talented individuals, but trying to solve for things that, unfortunately, we're all going to tap into at some point. Whether you're dealing with loved ones right now that are in the healthcare system, or you yourself later will, trying to make things that much better is part of the mission. So,
all right. Well, listen, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Shah, for being so generous with your time and giving us a few nuggets of wisdom here to ponder as we go forward. And I hope we'll have you back on the show in the future, and we can talk some more about healthcare and with the process guy, Dr. Keith Shah.
Well, Dr. Groves, I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Groves Connection, your connection to the inside story on healthcare, featuring in-depth interviews with those who know. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, give us a 5-star review to keep the connection going, and hit the subscribe button to be sure you never miss a beat. The Groves Connection is produced by Dr. Robert Groves. Original music, editing, and creative direction provided by Alden Groves. Production support, content guidance, courtesy of Janae Sharp and Elizabeth Barrett. Thank you for listening. The professional ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and do not reflect those of any current or past employers. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time on The Groves Connection.